Well, good morning. Are we on here? There we go. You can probably turn me down a little bit. Good morning and welcome to Crosspoint Church. You know what? There are visitors here today. I would like us as a church family to welcome them. Can we put our hands together? Welcome. We hope you feel right at home today. We are celebrating our nation's birthday, and the skit that we've just watched is something that actually happened. When the Declaration of Independence was signed 235 years ago, they didn't make an announcement on TV or the radio or through the internet. The news that we were free and had become a nation was delivered by mail carriers from town to town. And on the border of North and South Carolina, when the copy of the Declaration of Independence came to that region, the only person in that little border town who could read was a little 9-year-old boy, and his name was Andrew Jackson. He later became, as you know, the 7th President of the United States. Cool and true story from history. Now, the group of men who wrote the Declaration of Independence, they were not afraid to mix politics and religion. Some were devout Christians, others were a little more liberal in their faith, but they all 100% agreed that there was a creator God and therefore there was divine law. So the men that wrote the Declaration understood that a combination of state law and divine law is what would make this republic work. In other words, if we are going to create a nation that works, there needs to be an element of have to, which is state law, and an element of ought to, which is divine law. In their minds, these two things together was the foundation for freedom. Another thing that was very clear from the writings of these men is that they all believed that we were personally accountable to God and that we, as a nation, that we were accountable to God. Our forefathers believed in the other side of freedom. Not just a freedom from, but a freedom for. America wasn't established just so that we could be free from England and King George. Our founding fathers established this country because they believed in freedom, a God-based freedom, that it was a freedom for, a freedom to do something, an opportunity that all Americans would have. And we see this very clearly in the last paragraph of the Declaration of Independence. Look at these words. We, therefore, the representative of the United States of America, in General Congress assembled, and check out this next line, appealing to the supreme judge of the world. I wonder who they're talking about there. I think they're referring to God. They were saying, hey, we're appealing to a higher authority. What for? For the rectitude, that word means rightness, virtue, and goodness, for the rectitude of our intentions. They were saying, we believe that God is pleased with our intentions to establish a nation based on freedom. Not simply freedom from, but freedom to live as God believes we ought to live. So when our nation was founded, our forefathers purposely placed us under the canopy of God's authority and God's understanding of freedom. And this idea of freedom isn't simply a way to keep people from telling us what to do. This freedom is an opportunity to view freedom and to live out freedom through God's perspective of freedom. If you have your Bibles, you can turn with me to Galatians 5:13. If not, it will be right here on the screen. And I believe the idea of these verses that we're going to read shaped our founding fathers' thoughts on freedom, because Paul gives us some insight on how he believes God views freedom. And again, this other side of freedom that we're going to talk about today is a divine gift. It's not about being free from something, but free to do something. It's an opportunity that we have. Here's what Paul writes. He says, you, my brothers and sisters, were called to be free. We get that as Americans, don't we? But do not use your freedom to indulge the sinful nature. The implication here is that there is a dark side of freedom. We all get the dark side of freedom. I'm sure that the first time I really experienced it is when I got behind the wheel of my dad's pickup truck and there was nobody else in the car with me. You know, Mom wasn't there to say, slow down, son. My dad wasn't there to give me a discourse on how it's not good for the engine to run over 55 miles an hour. And so I put the pedal to the metal on those gravel roads, went spinning around, and I experienced the dark side of freedom because I ended up in the ditch. Some of us abuse freedom when we get behind the wheel of a car, right? I still have to admit to you, I still veer towards the dark side of freedom when I'm in a rush and in the car by myself. If Edith's there, I'm doing it straight. But if I'm by myself, here comes the dark side of freedom. Some of us understand this because when we went off to college, we abused freedom. And we just did whatever the heck we felt like we wanted to do, and we indulged our sinful nature. You see, it's really true. Freedom has a dark side. And that's what Paul is talking about here. He's saying, hey, don't abuse your freedom. Because freedom isn't simply freedom from rules and law. The other side of freedom, the mature understanding of freedom, is that we have been set free to do something. We have been given freedom for something. We have been given freedom as an opportunity. Listen to what Paul says next, because he tells us how God thinks we should use our freedom. Here's what he says. He says, hey, don't leverage your freedom to indulge in the sinful flesh. Rather, instead, I want you to live on the other side of freedom. Listen to what he says. Rather, use your freedom this way, to serve one another humbly in love. Leverage your freedom for the sake of others. Listen, true freedom is not about finding where the law is and saying, I wonder how close to the edge of this law I can come without breaking it. That's not true freedom. It's not about what I can get away with, and it's not even about what I have to do. Check it out. True freedom is expressed in this question: what is it that I ought to do? Listen to how Paul wraps this up. He says, for the entire law, the more than 600 laws the Israelites tried to live out, for the entire law is fulfilled in keeping this one command. Say it with me, it's here on the screen. Love your neighbor as yourself. Now think about this. This is so powerful. One simple command given here counterbalanced the entire law, and it's not a do not law. It's not like a state law. It's a do law, an ought to law, a divine law. Here it is. Love your neighbor as yourself. And here's the thing. Think about this. If everybody did this, if everybody lived on this other side of freedom, if we all subscribed to God's authority and His view of freedom, like our forefathers tried to inspire us to do by loving our neighbor as we love ourselves, almost all of our other laws would be irrelevant. And this is the point that Paul is trying to make. He's saying if you want to know what God's view of freedom is, it's this. It's not that you do or don't do something. It's that you have the opportunity. Everybody say opportunity. Opportunity to do something. It's not that you have to. It is you ought to. Our founding fathers understood this. That is why they wordsmithed the Declaration the way they did. You see, they understood that they could pass a law that says, thou shalt not hurt your neighbor, but they could not pass a law that says, thou shalt love thy neighbor. They couldn't do that. And so they appealed instead to our God-given desire for freedom this way. They said, hey guys, God has placed His divine law within all of our hearts, and this law is going to be the foundation of freedom for this country. This is what is going to inspire us to greatness. This is going to inspire us to live out our freedom, this ought to idea, this other side of freedom. Think about it this way. Are there any laws that inspire you? Stupid question, right? While we are grateful for the laws we have, they don't inspire us. And our forefathers understood this very clearly. That's why they appealed to a higher source of inspiration for our basis and foundation for freedom. Because, and here's why, check this out, because they knew we would need both sides of freedom to truly be free. And we would need both sides of freedom to truly live inspired lives. State law and divine law. Freedom from and freedom for. Here's what you have to do. Here's what you ought to do. And this is the canopy of freedom that our forefathers purposefully placed us under when this nation began. Because they realized that they could not create a system that inspires greatness in people. Because greatness is not fueled by law or constitution or anything else on this planet. People are inspired to greatness through God's perspective of freedom and the divine mandate that comes from Him to love your neighbor as yourself. This law, this divine law, is what moves people beyond the law to do what they ought to do. And the best way for us to leverage freedom is to ask ourselves this question. Here's the question I hope you take away from this and ask yourselves this in the coming days. With the freedom that I have been given, how do I love people the way that I want to be loved? With the freedom I've been given, how do I treat people the way that they want and deserve to be treated? Now, our founding fathers, here's what's so wonderful about our founding fathers. They didn't just write out this truth, they modeled it. When I was a little boy in kindergarten in 1964, right before L.B. Johnson was elected to president, my parents asked me, and they kid me about this all the time, Harvey, who are you going to vote for president? My family calls me Harvey. Harvey, who are you going to vote for president? And I said, I vote for George Washington for president. They laughed. They thought that that was really funny. But you know why I knew about George Washington? It's not just because he was the first president of the United States. It's because he modeled freedom. And he is known and loved and respected almost more than any president for the life he lived. Let's look at his life for a second. After the Revolutionary War, George Washington, a war hero, became the first president, and he served 2 terms. They tried to get him to run for a 3rd term, and he refused. Supposedly, when King George heard about this, he said, if George Washington refuses the offer for presidency for a 3rd term, he is the greatest man in the world. Because King George understood what incredible character it would take to give away this kind of power. Well, sure enough, after his 2nd term as president, George Washington returns to life as a normal citizen. But before he does, he gives a farewell address. And as he looks into the future of this nation, he gives us a bit of a warning. Here are his words, and they are unbelievably accurate some 200 years later. Check out what he says. Of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, check out what he says, religion and morality are indispensable supports. If he were making this speech today, about 80% of the room would say, you got to be kidding. We got the federal thing down. We've got an army. We're recognized by the whole world. I mean, seriously, George, do you really think we need religion and morality?